Winter, 1888. High atop Wolf-Tooth Peak, the most remote and lawless stretch of the American frontier. Firelight flickered across the bedroom walls as Alara let her dress fall to the floorboards, bearing scars she'd spent a lifetime hiding. The two towering twin brothers, Vance and Jude, stood frozen, their massive hands trembling, terrified that touching her might cause her more pain. She stepped forward and took their calloused hands in hers, no trace of fear left in her eyes. "Just look. Don't hold back," she whispered. That single line was all it took to bring two men, once thought unbreakable on this mountain, completely undone. But how does a mail-order bride, carrying a secret powerful enough to shake the East Coast, end up bringing two of the most feared trackers in the territory to their knees? And what does love like this actually cost? The answer is waiting for you right now. Stay till the very end. You won't want to miss this one. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the Mercantile, and the wind hit deadwood like a fist. Alara Hayes gripped the contract in her lap until her knuckles went white. Her leg throbbed from the ride. She'd been sitting wrong for 6 hours, favoring the bad hip, and now it screamed at her to move. She stepped down anyway, no cane. Not yet, not in front of strangers. The street was mud and ice, and every face turned toward her like she was something to be priced. A woman traveling alone in this part of the territory was rare enough. A woman traveling alone with an iron-bound trunk was rarer still. Sheriff Cobb met her before she'd taken 3 steps. He was a soft man in a hard town, the kind who'd learned to survive by knowing who to fear and who to rob. He looked Alabra over the way a buyer looks at livestock, and then his eyes dropped to the trunk. "That yours, miss?" "It is. Heavy for a woman traveling light." He smiled with most of his teeth. "Tell you what, storm's coming in. Why don't you let me hold on to that for you? Keep it safe in my office. I'll keep it with me." Wasn't a request. He reached for the trunk. Alara didn't let go. For one long second, the two of them stood there, pulling at the same handle, and the crowd around them went quiet, waiting to see how far the sheriff would push a crippled girl in the middle of the street. That was when the wind changed. It didn't die down slow. It just stopped, all at once, like the mountain itself had told it to. And in that stillness, 2 shapes came walking out of the whiteout at the edge of town, tall enough that for a moment folks thought the blizzard had grown legs. Twins, 6'5" apiece, beards thick with frost, shoulders wide enough to block the wind behind them. Identical faces, save for the scar running down the left one's cheek. They didn't hurry. Men who don't hurry are usually the ones who don't have to. Cobb's hand came off the trunk fast. "Kalen," he said, and his voice had lost its shine. Vance didn't answer him. He walked past the sheriff like he wasn't there, racked the lever on his Winchester, and put a bullet through the whiskey glass sitting on the porch rail 6 feet away. Glass and liquor sprayed across the boards. Cobb flinched so hard he nearly sat down in the mud. "That was for the noise," Vance said. "Next one's for you touching what's ours." Jude stepped up beside his brother, quiet the way a held breath is quiet. He looked at Alara first, not at her leg, not at the trunk, at her face. "Miss Hayes," he said, "we're the ones who sent for you." She hadn't expected the voice to be gentle. She'd built the twins up in her mind for weeks now, from the one letter they'd sent back, short and plain, no promises in it. She'd pictured brutes, men who wanted a bride the way they wanted a good mule, something to work the cabin while they worked the mountain. She hadn't pictured this. 2 men built like the side of a cliff, standing between her and a corrupt lawman, and neither one had raised his voice above a growl. "She carries our name now," Vance said, turning to face the crowd that had gathered along the boardwalk. His eyes were a strange gold, the kind you don't forget once you've seen them. "Every one of you. You touch our mail-order bride, Cobb, and I'll bury this whole town in the snow. Won't take long. Winter does most of the work for me." Nobody argued. Cobb backed up until his boots hit the porch steps, and he stayed there. Jude shrugged out of his coat, a great slab of bearskin that must have weighed as much as Alara herself, and settled it around her shoulders before she could refuse it. It smelled like wood smoke and pine. It was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fur. "You're limping," he said. Not a question. "I'm fine." Didn't ask if you were fine. Said you're limping. She met his eyes and found no pity there, which surprised her more than the coat had. Just plain attention, the kind a man gives to a problem he intends to solve. "Old injury," she said. "It acts up in the cold." Jude nodded once, like he was filing that away for later, and bent to lift her trunk onto his shoulder as if it held feathers instead of iron and secrets. Vance took her arm. Careful, like he'd been told exactly how much pressure a person could take before it hurt. "Horses are at the edge of town," Vance said. "It's a hard ride up. You tell us if you need to stop." "I won't need to stop." Something in his mouth almost moved into a smile. "Stubborn," he said. "Good. You'll need that where we're taking you." They walked her through the parting crowd, past the mercantile, past Cobb, who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes now. The whiteout swallowed the three of them whole, and Deadwood watched the KLN twins carry their bride home to the mountain, already telling themselves a story about what they'd witnessed, a story that would grow taller with every retelling, the way stories do in towns with nothing else to talk about. Elara didn't look back. She had a fortress now, two of them, in fact, walking on either side of her, and for the first time in longer than she could remember. The wind didn't feel like something trying to kill her. The trail out of Deadwood climbed before it did anything else. No gentle rise to ease into it, straight up. Snow packed hard under the horses' hooves, and every breath came out in a cloud that froze on Alara's scarf before it had time to drift away. Vance rode point, breaking trail through the deep drifts where the wind had piled the snow waist high. Jude rode behind, close enough to catch her if she slipped, far enough to give her room to manage on her own. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. Every so often, Vance would raise two fingers without turning around, and Jude would ease his horse left or right. Like they'd rehearsed a language nobody else was invited to learn. Elara watched that. She filed it away, the same way she filed everything now, out of habit built over years of needing to know who was dangerous and how. By the second hour, her hip had gone from an ache to a fire. She shifted in the saddle, tried to find an angle that didn't press against the old scar tissue, and found none. The horse's gait was steady, but steady wasn't the same as gentle, and every jolt sent a line of pain up through her spine. She didn't make a sound. She'd learned that lesson at the asylum, back when a whimper was an invitation for worse. Silence had kept her alive there. It would keep her useful here, and useful was the only role she planned on playing until she understood exactly what these men expected in return for a roof and a rifle. "You're quiet," Vance called back, not turning his head. Didn't realize talking was required. Wasn't complaining, just noticing. He glanced over his shoulder then, gold eyes catching the gray light. "Most folks who ride this trail the first time can't stop cussing the mountain by hour two." "I'm not most folks." "No," he said, starting to figure that. They climbed on. The trees thickened, pine and spruce heavy with snow, branches bowing low enough to brush the top of her head if she didn't duck in time. Somewhere off to the west, a wolf called, long and low, and the sound rolled down the mountainside and disappeared. "Wolves are quiet ones," Jude said from behind her. The first thing he'd offered in nearly an hour. "It's the ones that don't call that you watch for." That means something, or is it just mountain talk? Means, don't trust silence to tell you there's nothing out there. A pause, same goes for people. She turned in the saddle enough to look at him. His face gave nothing away, not unkindness, not warmth, just a plain statement offered the way a man hands over a tool he thinks you might need. "Is that a warning?" "It's an observation." He nudged his horse up half a length, closing the gap between them. "You've been sitting wrong in that saddle since we left town, favoring your left." Her stomach dropped. She'd thought she'd hidden it well enough. "Long ride," she said. "Anyone would be stiff. Anyone would shift around. Work the stiffness out. You've been holding one position for 2 hours, like moving costs you something." He said it without judgment, the way a man reads weather. "That true." "Old injury," she said again. The same words she'd given at the edge of town, hoping they'd land the same way and end the conversation. They didn't. Old injuries don't usually make a person ride like they're carrying glass, Jude said. But it's your business till you make it mine. She turned back around before he could see her face do something she didn't want it to do. Gratitude, maybe, or fear. She wasn't sure anymore which one came first these days. The trail steepened again as the afternoon wore thin and the light started dying early, the way it does in high country in winter. Vance called a halt at a stream crossing. Ice thick enough to walk on, but he tested it anyway. Boot heel first, before he let the horses cross. Careful here, he said, holding out a hand to help her down so the horses could pick their way over without a rider's weight. Footing's bad below the ice. She took his hand because refusing would have drawn more attention than accepting. And the moment her boots hit the ground, her leg buckled. She caught herself on the nearest thing, which happened to be his arm, solid as the trunk of a tree. And for a second, neither of them moved. Elara. It was the first time either twin had used her given name. It came out low, careful, like he was testing whether it belonged in his mouth. I'm fine, she said, straightening, forcing weight back onto the leg through sheer will. Ice caught me off guard. That's all. He didn't argue. He didn't have to. His eyes dropped to her hem, where a thin line of dark had started soaking through the wool, and his jaw went tight in a way that had nothing gentle left in it. You're bleeding. It's an old wound. It opens sometimes. It's nothing. That's not nothing. Jude had come up beside them now, dismounted, his gaze following his brother's down to the stain spreading slow across her skirt. That's blood freezing to your stirrup. She hadn't felt it happen. That was the worst part, she realized. Standing there with two enormous men staring at the evidence of a wound she'd spent the whole ride pretending didn't exist. She hadn't felt the moment it broke open, because she'd trained herself so thoroughly not to feel that kind of pain that her own body could betray her without so much as a warning. We need to look at that, Jude said. It'll keep till the cabin. It's already not keeping. He crouched, careful, giving her every chance to step back if she wanted to. She didn't. Whether that was trust or exhaustion, she couldn't say. Let me see. No. The word came out harder than she meant it to, sharp enough that both men went still. I'm not asking to shame you, Jude said. I was a medic before I was anything else up here. I've seen worse than a reopened wound. And I've seen it on stronger folks than either of us. But if that's frostbitten blood mixing with an open cut, you could lose more than time to it. And if I let you look, she said, voice shaking now despite every effort not to let it. And you don't like what you see. What then? Do I go back down the mountain? Back to Deadwood? Back to Cobb? Back to whatever fate you two decide a broken bride doesn't deserve? Vance's face changed at that. Something moved behind the gold of his eyes. Something that looked almost like the beginning of anger, though not at her. Is that what you think this is? He said. A return policy. She didn't answer, and the silence answered for her. Get on the horse, Vance said. Quieter now. We'll look at it at the cabin, in the warm, with proper light, and nobody's deciding anything about you. Till then, that's a promise, not a negotiation. She let Jude help her back up, and this time she let herself lean into his hands a fraction more than pride wanted to allow, because the leg wasn't going to hold much longer without help, and there was no version of this mountain where pretending otherwise did her any good. They rode the last 2 hours in a different kind of quiet, not the watchful quiet from before, but something heavier. Both men flanking her now instead of stringing out in a line, close enough that if she slid from the saddle, one of them would catch her before she hit the ground. The cabin appeared out of the trees just as the light gave out completely. Log walls thick as a man's arm was long. Smoke already curling from the chimney where they'd banked the fire that morning before riding down. It was bigger than she'd expected. 2 stories. A porch running the width of the front. Windows glowing gold against the blue dark of dusk. Jude lifted her down this time, and didn't let go once her boots touched the ground. He kept an arm braced under hers as they climbed the porch steps, and Vance shouldered the door open ahead of them, already moving to build the fire higher. Inside, the warmth hit her like a wall. And for the first time since Deadwood, Elara let her guard slip enough to feel how tired she was. Not just the ride, years of it. Years of holding herself upright through pain that would have folded most people in half. "Sit," Jude said, guiding her to a chair near the hearth. "Let me look now, please." She looked at Vance, who'd gone still by the fire, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not pity, something closer to dread, like a man bracing for news he already suspected. "All right," she said finally. And the word cost her more than the whole ride up the mountain had. Jude knelt in front of her chair and reached for the hem of her skirt, slow, giving her every chance to stop him. She didn't stop him. And that was when the twins of Wolf Tooth Peak got their first real look at what they'd bought and what they'd been sent to save. The fabric came away slow, and Jude worked with the kind of care most men never learn, the care of someone who's had to peel bandages off wounds that mattered more than pride. The skin underneath told a story neither twin was prepared for. Scar tissue ran the length of her thigh, thick and rope-like in places, thin and shining in others, where the burns had gone deep enough to leave the flesh pale forever. Some of the marks were old, faded to silver with age. Others were newer, angrier, the kind that never fully closed, because whatever caused them kept coming back. Jude's hands went still. "Elara," he said, and his voice had lost every ounce of the calm it usually carried. "Who did this to you?" She sat rigid in the chair, chin lifted, bracing for the look she'd seen 100 times before. The flinch, the pity dressed up as concern, the subtle way people's eyes changed once they saw the truth of a body that had survived something ugly. "Does it matter?" she said. "You have your answer now. This is what you sent for. Not a wife, not even a whole woman. Just this." She reached down and yanked the fabric back over her leg, hand shaking, and started to rise from the chair. "Sit down," Vance said. It wasn't a command shouted in anger. It came out low, almost broken. And when she looked up at him, she found the fearsome man from the street in Deadwood gone entirely, replaced by someone standing very still, with his fists clenched at his sides, like he was fighting the urge to put them through a wall. I said, "Sit down. Elara, please." She sat more out of confusion than obedience. Jude hadn't moved from the floor in front of her chair. He reached out again, this time not for the wound but for her hand, resting on her knee. And he held it the way a person holds something they're afraid of breaking. "This is what you bought," Elara said again, quieter now, some of the fire gone out of it. "Don't pity me, pity." Vance said the word like it tasted wrong in his mouth. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees on her other side, so that she sat between the two of them. Twin men who'd spent years being the most feared thing on this mountain, now kneeling on their own floorboards like the ground had asked something of them. "You think this is pity. What else would it be?" "Fury," he said. "It's fury. Elara, at whoever put their hands on you and thought they had the right." His hands hovered over the scars on her leg, close but not touching, like he needed permission he didn't know how to ask for. "You rode 8 hours up a mountain with a wound bleeding into your boot and didn't say a single word. You've been carrying this like it's something to be ashamed of, and I am telling you right now, the only thing in this room that deserves shame isn't sitting in this chair." Jude pressed his scarred cheek against her uninjured knee, an act so unexpected, so tender, that Elara's breath caught somewhere in her chest and refused to come back out properly. "I've patched up men after Antietam," he said, voice muffled against her skirt. "I've held things together that shouldn't have held. I know what survival costs a body. This isn't ugly to me. This is proof you're still here." She didn't cry. She'd trained that out of herself years ago, the same way she'd trained out the whimpering, because tears at the asylum earned you nothing but longer sessions with the doctors who called themselves healers. But something in her chest went loose for the first time in longer than she could remember. Some knot she hadn't realized she'd been holding since she was 17 years old and locked behind Blackwell's iron gates. "I thought you'd send me back." she said finally. Or worse. I've heard what happens to brides who don't measure up out here. I thought showing you first, before you found out some other way, at least gave me the chance to leave with what's left of my dignity. Nobody's sending you anywhere. Vance's hand finally settled on her leg, over the scar tissue, warm and steady. No flinch in it at all. Nobody's touching you that doesn't ask first, and means to be gentle when they do. That's the only kind of claiming that happens in this house. You don't even know me. We know you rode 8 hours without complaint while bleeding, Jude said. We know you stood in the street in Deadwood and didn't let Cobb take that trunk without a fight, crippled leg and all. We know plenty. The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, the wind had picked back up, throwing snow against the windows in soft handfuls. But inside the cabin, it was warm enough that Alara realized she'd stopped shivering sometime in the last few minutes without noticing when it happened. There's salve, Jude said eventually, straightening. Some of his medic's manner returning now that the moment had passed into something steadier, and clean bandages. It'll sting before it helps, but the wound needs cleaning tonight or it'll fester by morning. Do it, she said. He did, hands sure and gentle. And Vance stayed kneeling beside her the whole time, holding her hand, though she hadn't asked him to. And somewhere, in that hour, Elara Hayes understood that she had walked into something entirely different from what she'd planned on when she'd answered that advertisement 3 weeks ago. She'd been looking for a fortress. 2 brutal men who wouldn't ask questions, who'd stand between her and anyone Thorne sent up this mountain. She hadn't planned on being seen, actually seen, scars and all, and not turned away for it. That was a complication she hadn't budgeted for. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither Elara nor the twins had expected, and none of them commented on it out loud. The way people don't comment on good weather for fear of jinxing it. Vance handled the perimeter each morning before light, checking the traps and the wire he and Jude had strung through the tree line years ago. Back when the only thing they'd needed to guard against was hungry wolves and the occasional fool who wandered too far up the mountain looking for trouble. He'd come back inside with frost in his beard and stamp the snow off his boots on the porch before he'd even think of coming near the fire, like he didn't want to track the cold in on top of her. Jude took over the wound. Twice a day he cleaned it, checked for fever, and each time his hands stayed steady and his voice stayed level, like a man handling something precious enough to require his full attention and nothing less. Elara, for her part, refused to sit idle. I can cook, she told them the second morning, already up and moving around the kitchen before either twin had finished their coffee. I can mend. I can shoot. And I know things about tracking men that neither of you have had reason to learn. Vance raised an eyebrow over his cup. That's so. I didn't escape Blackwell by luck, she said. I escaped it by knowing exactly how men like Cobb think, and exactly what it takes to disappear from men who don't want you to. Then teach us, Jude said. Simple as that. No argument in it at all. So she did, over the following days, while the leg healed enough to bear weight without shaking. She showed them how to read the tells in a man's stance that meant he was reaching for a weapon before his hand ever moved. She showed Vance how to mix black powder from saltpeter and sulfur they had stored in the cellar. Ratios she'd learned from a woman at the asylum who'd once worked in a mining town before her husband had her committed for the crime of being smarter than him. She mapped the cabin's defenses on a scrap of paper, marking sightlines and blind spots, and Jude studied it like scripture, adjusting the wire out past the tree line based on what she pointed out. You've done this before, Vance said one evening, watching her mark an X where the wood pile blocked a clean shot from the porch. Planned a defense, I mean. I've had to think about how to survive since I was 17 years old, she said. You learn things in a place like Blackwell, not because anyone teaches you kindly, because the alternative is not learning them and not surviving. He didn't push for more than that. She noticed both twins had a habit of not pushing, of letting her offer what she was ready to offer, and no more. And that restraint said more to her than any declaration could have. The nights were the strangest part. She'd expected discomfort, some awkward negotiation of a cabin built for two men now holding three people who barely knew each other. Instead, the twins had simply made room. Jude took the small room off the kitchen. Vance kept to the loft. Elara had the room that must have been meant for a wife from the start, given how it was already furnished with a proper bed and a chest of drawers, like they'd built it with hope years before they'd had any reason to. It was on the fifth night that Jude brought out the harmonica. He didn't announce it. He simply sat by the fire after supper, turned the small instrument over in his hands a few times, like he was deciding whether the room deserved the sound. And then he played. It wasn't a tune Elara recognized, something slow and low, more felt than heard. The kind of music that didn't need words because the notes said everything on their own. Vance, sitting across the room mending a bridle, went still and listened, without seeming to realize he'd stopped working. "Where'd you learn that?" Elara asked. "Our mother," Jude said, not looking up from the instrument. "Before she passed, she used to play it when the winters got too long and the walls started feeling smaller than they were. It's beautiful. It's the only soft thing either of us kept from before this mountain," Vance said, setting the bridle aside. Rest went into the ground with her. Elara sat with that a moment, the weight of two men who'd built their whole lives out of hard labor and harder solitude, keeping one gentle thing alive between them, because letting it go felt like losing her twice. "Dance with me," she said, before she'd quite decided to say it. Both twins looked up at once, twin expressions of surprise so identical it might have been comic in a different moment. "I can't," she added, before either could answer. "Not properly. The leg won't allow it. But I haven't danced since before Blackwell, and I find I'd like to remember what it feels like, even a little." Vance was the one who moved first. He crossed the room and took her cane from where it leaned against her chair, setting it aside. And then he wrapped his arms around her instead, careful taking her full weight so the leg didn't have to bear anything at all. "Better," he said. "You lead with your voice. I'll do the rest." Jude set the harmonica down long enough to rise and step in behind her, close enough that she was boxed between the two of them, held up entirely by their combined strength. And then he picked the tune back up, playing it slower now to match the sway Vance had started. Small and rocking, barely a dance at all, and somehow more than any dance she'd known before. The firelight moved across the walls. Outside, the wind had gone quiet for once, like even the mountain wanted to listen. "This is foolish," Elara said, though she made no move to stop. "Foolish is allowed up here," Vance murmured against her hair. "Nobody's watching but us." She closed her eyes and let herself be held. Let herself stop calculating exits and weaknesses, and the next move in whatever game Thorne was playing down in the valley, if only for the length of one slow song played on a dead woman's harmonica by a man who'd loved her enough to keep the instrument through years of solitude that should have hardened him past softness. Three broken people, swaying in the firelight of a cabin at the top of the world. It wasn't love yet. Elara wasn't foolish enough to call it that so soon. Not after everything Blackwell had taught her about the distance between what men promised and what they delivered. But it was something. A door left open, where she'd expected only walls. And for the first time since she'd boarded that stagecoach with a false bottom trunk and a ledger that could burn half the East Coast to the ground, Elara Hayes let herself imagine a version of survival that didn't end in running. The messenger came up the mountain on a horse that looked half dead. Stumbling through the last stretch of trail before it hit the wire Vance had strung through the trees. The animal caught the line at chest height, and the messenger went over its neck, landing hard in the snow. And by the time Vance reached him with his rifle already raised, the man was bleeding from where the wire had caught him, and too winded to do anything but hold up both hands. "Message," the man gasped. "Just a message. For the twins. And the woman." Vance hauled him up by the collar and marched him the rest of the way to the cabin, boots dragging furrows through the snow. Jude met them on the porch, and Elara came to the window at the sound of the commotion. legs strong enough now to carry her there without the cane. "Who sent you?" Vance said. "Man named Thorne, paying good money to anybody willing to make the climb." The messenger's teeth were chattering, whether from cold or fear. Hard to say which. Said to give this to the woman directly. Said she'd know what it meant. He held out a folded paper, sealed with wax, and Jude took it before the man could get any closer to the door. He broke the seal and read it once, his jaw setting hard enough that a muscle jumped along it, and then he handed it to Alara without a word. She read it standing in the doorway, the cold pouring in around her, and her hands didn't shake, though everything underneath her skin had gone tight and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "Miss Hayes, or should I say, inmate 447. You have something that belongs to certain gentlemen back east, and they are prepared to pay handsomely for its return, along with your safe passage far from here. $5,000, delivered to whoever brings you and the trunk down from that mountain. The offer stands for 1 week. After that, I stop asking nicely. You know what I'm capable of. You watched me do it to the others. S. Thorne." "Who's Thorne?" Vance said, watching her face too closely for her to hide anything from him now. "He's the man who hunts for the people who ran Blackwell," Alara said, "the asylum I told you about. He's called the Hound, because he's never failed to bring back what he was sent for. He failed with you. He hasn't started trying yet." "Not really. Not until now." She folded the letter, hands finally beginning to tremble. The delayed reaction, catching up to her, the way it always did once the danger had passed, and there was room to feel it. $5,000 is more money than either of you have seen in your lives. I'd wager. That's not a threat. That's an offer. And there isn't a man in this territory who wouldn't consider it. There's 2 right here who wouldn't, Jude said. You don't know what he's offering yet. It's not just the money. Alara turned to face them both, and something in her had already started building the wall she used whenever she prepared to lose something. He'll offer to leave you both alone. He'll offer to forget your names, forget this cabin, forget you exist, so long as he gets what he came for. That's a fair trade for 2 men who never asked to be caught up in someone else's war. Send the messenger back, Vance told Jude, not taking his eyes off Alara. Tell him the answer's no, and tell him if Thorne comes up this mountain himself, he won't be walking back down it. The messenger didn't wait to be told twice. He scrambled back onto his horse and rode off into the trees like the mountain itself was chasing him. And once the sound of hooves faded, Alara turned and walked back inside without another word. She went straight to her trunk. Vance and Jude followed her in, exchanging a look neither of them bothered to hide, and watched as she knelt and worked her fingers along the seam at the bottom of the trunk until something gave way. With a soft click, the false bottom lifted free, revealing a leather-bound ledger underneath, its pages thick with names, dates, sums of money, and the kind of careful handwriting that comes from someone documenting a crime with the intention of using it later. "This is what he wants," she said, holding it up. "Not me, this." "What is it?" Jude asked. "A record of every disabled woman that asylum sold off to men who paid for the privilege of owning something helpless. Names of the doctors who signed the papers, calling us insane for the crime of being poor, or crippled, or inconvenient to somebody with money. Names of the men who bought us." Her voice had gone flat. The voices do when a person has told themselves a story so many times it stops hurting in the usual places and starts hurting somewhere new instead. I copied it by hand over 8 months, 1 page at a time. While the staff thought I was too simple to write more than my own name, I used their arrogance against them. "It's the only weapon I had, and you used our advertisement to hide it," Vance said, not an accusation. A statement. Like he was working through the shape of something. "I used your advertisement to disappear into the most remote, most dangerous stretch of territory I could find. I picked Wolf Tooth Peak because the letters about you 2 made it clear. Nobody sane would follow a woman up here without good reason. I thought I'd found men who'd keep me safe without asking too many questions. And once the danger passed, I'd move on before you ever learned what you'd taken in. She stood, ledger in hand, and started for the door. Where are you going? Jude said. I'm going to face him myself. Before he brings that whole army up this mountain and gets you both killed over a fight that isn't yours. She reached for her coat. I never meant to make you targets. I'll take the ledger, and I'll take whatever comes with it. And you two can go back to the life you had before I answered that ad. Vance crossed the room in 3 strides and kicked her travel bag clean across the floorboards, sending it skidding into the wall hard enough to rattle the shelf above it. You think we care about a piece of paper, he said, and his voice had dropped into something low and dangerous. The same register he'd used on Sheriff Cobb back in Deadwood. Jude, meanwhile, had crossed the door and thrown the heavy oak deadbolt, sealing it shut with a sound of finality that echoed through the whole cabin. You answered our ad, Vance said, stepping close enough that Alara had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. You took our name in front of the whole town. You danced with us by that fire. You are our wife. Alara, whether you came here running from something or not, and if an army is coming for you, then an army is going to die on our mountain. You don't understand what he's capable of. No, Jude said, coming up on her other side. But we understand what we're capable of. And I promise you, it's worse. She stood there between them, the ledger clutched against her chest, and felt the wall she'd been building since the letter arrived start to crumble in a way she hadn't expected and didn't entirely know how to stop. I don't want either of you dying for my sins, she said, quieter now. They're not your sins, Vance said. You didn't sell disabled women to rich men. You didn't lock them up and call it medicine. You wrote down what they did, at the risk of your own life, so somebody someday could make them answer for it. That's not a sin, Alara. That's the bravest thing I've ever heard of a person doing. For the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Deadwood, Alara Hayes let herself cry, and neither twin looked away from it, and neither twin called it weakness. The cabin became something different after that night. Not a home exactly. Not yet, but a war room. The kind of place where every conversation eventually circled back to the same question. How do we survive what's coming? Alara set to work the next morning with a focus that surprised even her. She spread her paper map of the property across the kitchen table, weighted down at the corners with cups nobody had bothered to wash, and began marking every point where Thorne's men might try to approach. He won't send an army first, she told the twins, tracing a line along the tree edge with her finger. That's not his style. He'll send 1 or 2 scouts to test the perimeter. See what kind of defenses we've built. Look for the weak points before he commits real numbers to the climb. How do you know that? Vance asked. Because he did the same thing before he caught the last woman who ran from Blackwell. Sent 2 men ahead to watch her cabin for 3 days before he moved. She never saw them coming because she was watching the road, not the tree line. Elara's jaw tightened at the memory. He got her back. I don't intend to make the same mistake. She taught Jude how to render wolfsbane from the roots that grew wild along the northern ridge, showing him how to boil it down into something concentrated enough to lace the traps without harming the wildlife he relied on for winter meat. It was slow, careful work, and Jude took to it the way he took to everything medical, patient and exact, asking questions that showed he understood the chemistry of it better than most men would have bothered to. You've done this before, too, he said, watching a thin trail of steam rise off the pot. There was a woman at Blackwell who used to work in a mining camp before her husband had her committed, said she, embarrassed him by understanding blasting powder better than the men he worked with. She taught a few of us what she knew, in case any of us ever found a way out and needed it. Alara stirred the mixture with a long wooden spoon. Funny, isn't it? The very things that got us locked away turned out to be the things that got us free. Nothing funny about that, Jude said. Sounds more like justice, working itself out slow. With Vance, she worked through tactics instead of chemistry, laying out likely approach routes based on what she knew of how mercenaries from the East thought about terrain. Men who'd made their careers hunting people in cities and open country didn't always understand mountains. And she showed Vance where that ignorance would likely show itself. "They'll come up the south face," she said, tapping the map. "It looks like the easier climb from a distance, but it funnels into that narrow pass, the one with the rock overhang. Any man with mountain sense would avoid it, 'cause it's a killing ground if somebody's waiting above. But city men look at a map and see the shortest route, not the trap." Vance studied the spot she'd marked, and something like respect moved across his face, plain and unhidden. "You'd have made a hell of a soldier." "I'd have made a hell of a lot of things, if anyone had let me," she said. And there wasn't bitterness in it anymore, just fact. They spent their evenings drilling the same routines until each of them could execute their part without thinking. Vance covering the ridge line with the rifle, Jude managing the traps and the close defense around the cabin itself, Elara positioned to coordinate between them. Her knowledge of Thorne's methods worth more than any single gun. "You keep saying you're not a soldier," Vance told her one night, as they sat going over the map by firelight. "For what must have been the 10th time that week, but you think like one. Better than most men I served with." "I had to," she said. The alternative to thinking clearly was going back to Blackwell, or somewhere worse. Fear does strange things to the mind. Sometimes it makes people stupid. Sometimes it makes them sharp. I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to let it make me stupid. That's the whole secret of it, isn't it?" Jude said, looking up from where he'd been checking the edge on a hunting knife. "Most folks think courage is not being scared. It's not that at all. It's being scared plenty and doing the smart thing anyway." Elara looked at him for a long moment, turning that over. "I've never heard anyone put it that way before." "Learned it in the war," he said simply. "Every man who told me he wasn't scared was either lying or about to get himself killed. The ones who lived were the ones who admitted the fear and worked around it instead of pretending it wasn't there." The days passed like that. Hard work by daylight and quiet talk by the fire once the work was done. And somewhere in the middle of all that planning, Elara realized the three of them had stopped operating as a woman, and the two men who happened to shelter her, and started operating as something closer to a single unit, each one covering a piece the others couldn't. She taught them. They protected her, and somewhere in the exchange, none of them were quite the same people who'd first collided on that street in Deadwood. Thorne's scouts came on the 8th day, exactly the way Elara had predicted, moving through the tree line at dusk when the light played tricks on a person's eyes and made shapes harder to trust. Vance spotted them first from his position on the ridge, two men working their way along the south face, exactly where Elara had said they would, testing the ground the way men do when they expect a trap, but aren't sure where it's hiding. He didn't fire, not yet. He watched them long enough to confirm their numbers, then signaled Jude with the low whistle they'd practiced all week. And by the time the scouts realized they'd stumbled into occupied territory, it was already too late for them to report back what they'd learned. That should have bought a few more days. It didn't. Thorne had apparently expected the scouts to fail, because the real assault came only 2 days later, at the tree line just before dawn, when the light was thinnest and the cold had settled deep enough into everyone's bones to slow reactions half a second, which on a mountain like this could be the whole difference between living and dying. Elara heard the first shot from inside the cabin and was moving before the sound had finished echoing off the peaks. "Positions," she shouted, and Jude was already out the door, rifle in hand, moving toward the wire, where the wolfsbane traps waited for anybody foolish enough to rush the approach without knowing the ground. The fight that followed wasn't clean. Real fights never are, not the way dime novels tell it, men shouted. Snow kicked up in white sprays wherever bullets struck close. Somewhere in the confusion, a man screamed as he hit one of the traps, the wolfsbane doing it slow, terrible work. And Elara heard the sound and didn't let herself think too hard about what it meant. She was posted at the kitchen window, rifle steady on the sill, watching for movement through the gaps in the trees the way she'd studied for a week straight. When a shape broke from cover, she fired, and the shape went down. And she didn't have time to feel anything about that either, because there was another shape right behind it. It was mid-fight when she heard Jude's voice change. Not a shout, a grunt cut off hard, followed by silence where there should have been the steady crack of his rifle. She looked out through the side window and saw him pinned beneath a fallen section of the woodpile, a shot having taken him in the shoulder and knocked him backward hard enough to bring the stacked logs down on top of him. He was struggling, one arm useless, blood already dark against the snow, and two of Thorne's men were closing on his position with the kind of certainty that meant they'd seen a wounded target and intended to finish it. Elara didn't think. She moved. She was out the kitchen door and around the side of the cabin before some rational part of her brain could remind her that she had a bad leg and no business sprinting through open ground under fire. Vance's rifle cracked from the ridge, laying down suppression, buying her the half-second she needed. And she used it. She reached the woodpile at a dead run and dropped to her knees beside it, ignoring the pain that lit up her hip like a struck match, and got her hands on the chain she'd rigged to the harness of the draft horses 3 days earlier, a contingency she'd insisted on, despite Jude's protest that it was overcautious. It wasn't overcautious now. She hooked the chain fast, hands tearing on the rough iron links, and half crawled, half dragged herself to where the horses waited in their makeshift shelter, spooked by the gunfire but held steady by the training the twins had put into them over years on this mountain. "Come on," she said, low and urgent, taking the lead line. "Come on, please. Now." She whipped the horses forward and the chain went taut, and for one terrible second, nothing happened. The logs too heavy, the ground too frozen, and then something gave, and the whole pile shifted, dragging clear of Jude in a shower of snow and splintered wood. He gasped in a breath the moment the weight came off his chest, and Elara was there instantly, hauling at his good arm, dragging him back toward the cover of the cabin wall while Vance's rifle kept firing overhead. Methodical, relentless, driving back the two men who'd nearly reached them. "You shouldn't have," Jude managed, teeth gritted against the pain in his shoulder. "Shouldn't have come out in the open like that. You'd have died under that woodpile." She snapped back, pressing her palm hard against the wound to slow the bleeding. "I wasn't going to stand at that window and watch it happen." Her hands were torn raw from the chain. Her leg had given out somewhere in the last stretch of the crawl, and she was dragging it now more than walking on it. But she got him to the wall, got his back against solid logs where the angle protected him from the worst of the gunfire, and stayed with him, applying pressure until Vance came down off the ridge at a dead run, the fight having finally broken in their favor as the last of Thorne's assault force either fell back or fell down. "Jude," Vance said, dropping beside them, hands already moving to check the wound with the same fast competence his brother would have shown if their positions were reversed. "I'm alive," Jude said, "because of her." Vance looked up at Elara then, kneeling in the bloody snow with her hands torn and her leg shaking under her. And something passed across his face that she'd remember for a long time after. Something too large for words. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could he," she said. "I made a choice. I'd make it again." They got Jude inside, got the shoulder cleaned and bound properly, and by the time the adrenaline had drained out of all three of them, leaving the shaking aftermath that always follows violence. The light outside had shifted from the gray of dawn to the pale gold of a winter morning that had somehow, against every expectation, arrived with all three of them still breathing. "You did that," Vance said later, watching her wrap her own torn hands with strips of bandage while Jude rested by the fire, the color slowly returning to his face. Pulled him clear. Didn't wait for permission. Didn't wait for somebody braver to do it. Just did it. "I told you I wasn't a damsel," Elara said, wincing as she tied off the bandage. "You should probably start believing me." "Believe you," Jude said from the fire, voice rough but steady. "Woman just proved. She belongs on this mountain more than half the men who've tried to claim it." Outside, the wind had died down to something almost peaceful, and the mountains sat quiet under new snow, the fight's evidence already being buried by the same weather that had first hidden the twins' approach into Deadwood weeks ago. But everyone in that cabin understood the quiet wouldn't last. Thorne had lost this round. But a man they called the Hound didn't quit over one bad morning. The next attack would be worse, and it would come soon. The night came down hard and early, the way it does in the mountains once true winter settles in. And with it came the sound Vance had been listening for all week without saying so, out loud. Boots on frozen ground, more than a few pairs, moving with purpose through the trees below the cabin. "They're coming," he said, checking the rifle by the door. Bigger number this time. Jude was still favoring his shoulder, the wound from days before healing slow the way gunshot wounds do in the cold. But he strapped on his gun belt anyway and reached for his rifle with his good arm. "You should stay inside," Elara told him. "You can barely raise that arm above your waist." "I can pull a trigger just fine," Jude said. "Won't be doing any climbing tonight, but I can hold a door." There wasn't time to argue the point further. Vance slipped out into the dark to take the ridge position that had worked so well the last time, and Elara barred the windows the way they'd practiced, while Jude took up a spot near the hearth where he could cover both the front door and the narrow hall leading to the bedrooms. The first sound of real trouble came from above, a scrape across the roof, faint at first, easy to mistake for wind, except the wind had died down an hour ago and hadn't picked back up. Elara froze at the kitchen table, eyes going up to the rafters, and Jude's gaze followed hers. "Someone's on the roof," he said, low. "How?" "Same way anybody gets anywhere in this territory. Determination and a rope." He was already moving, positioning himself at an angle that gave him a line on the chimney flue, the weak point in any cabin roof, the place a desperate man might try to drop through if the doors and windows were too well defended to risk. The scraping stopped. Silence stretched out long enough that Elara started to think maybe it had been nothing after all. Some animal spooked by the earlier commotion, nothing more. Then the section of roof above the kitchen gave way in a shower of splintered wood and old snow, and a man dropped through the gap, landing hard on the kitchen table, scattering the map and the cups and the lantern that had been sitting there only a moment before. Silas Thorne came up off the table with a revolver already in hand, and even in the dim firelight, Elara recognized him instantly from the description that had followed her for 2 years. The description whispered by every woman who'd ever escaped Blackwell and lived long enough to warn the next one. He was lean where the Kalen twins were broad, precise where they were raw force, and his eyes had the flat, patient look of a man who'd made a career out of never losing his temper while doing terrible things. "Miss Hayes," he said, leveling the revolver at her before Jude could bring his own weapon fully around. "You've cost my employers a great deal of money and a great deal of patience. Both are running thin." "Drop it," Jude said, his rifle already up. But Thorne had positioned himself close enough to Elara that any shot risked catching her too, and the man knew it, had planned for it, the way he planned for everything. "Shoot me, medic, and the shock alone might put a bullet through her before I hit the ground. I've seen it happen. Muscles don't always know they're dead right away." Thorne's eyes flicked to Jude's shoulder, noting the stiff way he held it. "You're already wounded. Slow. I don't like those odds if I were you." "What do you want?" Elara said, keeping her voice steadier than she felt. "The ledger. And you alive, so my employers can decide for themselves what your fate ought to be. That's the polite version of tonight." Thorne's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "The impolite version involves your mountain men bleeding out on this floor while I take the ledger anyway. Your choice which one happens. There's no version of tonight where you walk out of here," Jude said. "There's no version of tonight where you and your brother both live if this goes to guns," Thorne countered. "I count one wounded man, one woman with a bad leg, and a brother out in the dark, somewhere I can't see. Not terrible odds. Not for a man who's done this a great many times." Elara's mind was already working, the way it had worked through every crisis at Blackwell, the way it had worked planning this defense for the last 2 weeks. Thorne was confident. Thorne had reason to be. But confident men rarely accounted for the small, ugly details, the ones that didn't look like weapons until it was too late. The flour sacks sat on the shelf behind her, 3 of them, stacked from the baking she and Jude had done together only days before, back when the biggest danger in the kitchen had been burning the bread. "You called me a crippled mail-order whore back in that letter," she said, keeping Thorne's eyes on her face instead of her hands. "You didn't say to my face, though. Funny that. Men like you always find it easier from a distance." "I'll say it now, if it pleases you," Thorne said, something ugly moving behind his composure. "Crippled, broken. A liar who stole what wasn't hers and hid behind 2 brutes too stupid to ask what they were harboring. That's a lot of words for a man about to lose," Elara said, and reached back and slashed the nearest flour sack open with the kitchen knife she'd kept hidden in her apron since the shooting started outside. The sack burst in a cloud of white, filling the small kitchen instantly, choking the air thick enough that Thorne's aim wavered, his eyes stinging. And Elara didn't stop, slashing the second sack and then the third, the whole room turning into a blinding fog of flour dust that swallowed the lantern light whole. "What is this?" Thorne coughed, swinging the revolver blindly. "Education," Elara said, backing toward the hearth, pulling her own revolver from her waistband, where she'd kept it hidden through the whole exchange. "Flour dust burns, mister. Thorne, any miner could tell you that. Any baker who's ever had a mill catch fire could tell you that too. Fine enough dust, packed thick enough in the air, and one spark turns a kitchen into a furnace." Thorne's eyes went wide behind the choking cloud, understanding arriving a half-second too late. Elara raised her revolver and fired directly into the blazing hearth. The flour ignited with a roar that shook the walls, a wave of heat and force ripping through the kitchen and slamming Thorne backward off his feet, the revolver flying from his hand as he crashed through the already broken door and out onto the porch in a heap of scorched coat and singed hair. The blast knocked Elara back too, but she'd braced for it, back against the stone of the hearth where the fire itself couldn't reach her. And she came up out of the smoke with her ears ringing and her revolver still in hand, and walked out onto the porch where Thorne lay stunned in the snow, coughing, one hand groping uselessly for a weapon that wasn't there anymore. "You should have stayed back east," she said, standing over him, and there was no shake left in her voice at all now, only a cold, clean certainty that had been 2 years in the making. "You should have left us alone." Elara, his voice came out cracked, pleading in a way she'd never expected from the Hound of Blackwell. "There's money, more money than you can imagine. Just walk away. Let me take the ledger." And none of this, she fired once, and it was over. Jude appeared in the shattered doorway a moment later, rifle still raised, taking in the scene, the scorched kitchen, the man in the snow, and Elara standing over him with smoke still curling off her sleeve. "Elara, he's not getting up," she said, and only then did her hands start to shake, the revolver suddenly heavy in her torn, bandaged fingers. "It's done, Jude. It's finally done." Vance came running from the tree line at the sound of the blast and found the 2 of them standing together on the ruined porch, and understood without needing to be told that whatever had come for them tonight wasn't coming again. Morning brought a stillness that felt earned rather than given, the kind of quiet that settles after a debt has finally been paid in full. Vance found Sheriff Cobb hiding in the root cellar of an abandoned trapper's shack a half-mile down the mountain, having fled Deadwood the moment word of Thorne's assault reached town, apparently deciding that whatever side was going to win this fight. Being nowhere near the losing side seemed the wiser plan. He dragged Cobb back to the cabin by the collar, the same way he'd dragged him metaphorically through the mud back in Deadwood weeks before, and deposited him in a chair by the ruined kitchen, where Elara and Jude were already at work, clearing the wreckage of the flour and the broken table. Cobb was whimpering before anyone said a word to him, please," he said, eyes darting between the twins and Alara like he couldn't decide who to beg first. "I never meant any harm. Thorn paid me to look the other way. That's all it ever was. I never touched the ledger. Never touched you. I just looked the other way." "Looking the other way is how men like Thorn stay in business," Alara said, wiping soot from her hands. "You're not innocent because your hands didn't do the ugly work. You're guilty because you let the ugly work happen where you could have stopped it." Vance drew his knife, testing the edge against his thumb, and Cobb's whimpering climbed into something closer to a wail. Alara held up a hand. "Wait." Vance stopped, looking at her, waiting. "A bullet just puts you in the dirt." "Cobb," she said, crossing to stand in front of the shaking sheriff. "A grave nobody visits. A name nobody remembers past the season. That's not justice. That's mercy, and you haven't earned mercy." She pulled a chair up in front of him and set down paper and a pen from the ruined kitchen shelf, salvaged from the wreckage, along with everything else that had survived the blast. "You're going to write down everything," she said. "Every payment you took from Thorn, every woman you looked away from, every crime you let walk through Deadwood because it lined your pocket. And then you're going to sign your name to it. And that confession is going east with the ledger to a federal judge who has no reason to protect men like you." "You'd let me live," Cobb said, disbelieving, "for a piece of paper." "I'd let the law decide what happens to you," Alara said. "That's more than you ever offered anyone at Blackwell. But this ink will burn your legacy to ash long after any bullet would have finished you quick and let you off easy. You're going to spend whatever years you have left known for exactly what you are. That's worse than dying. Cobb, if you had any conscience left to feel it." Cobb wrote. His hand shook through the whole thing, but he wrote, page after page, and by the time he finished, the sun had climbed well past noon, and the confession sat thick and damning on the table, more valuable in its way than the ledger itself, because it was a local voice, confirming everything the ledger only hinted at from a distance. Vance took Cobb back down to Deadwood that afternoon, delivering him into custody of the territorial marshal who'd been summoned by Ryder 2 days before. And by evening, the cabin stood quiet again. The immediate danger passed. The reckoning set in motion. That night, after the fires had been banked, and the wreckage of the kitchen swept into some semblance of order, the storm that had threatened all week finally broke, and with it came a different kind of quiet, one that had nothing to do with danger, and everything to do with what came after it. Alara stood in the bedroom that had been hers since that first night, listening to the wind finally settle outside, and understood that something in her had settled along with it. The running was over. The hiding was over. Whatever came next, she wasn't facing it alone, and she wasn't facing it as a woman with something to hide. She thought of Vance's hands, careful over her scars that first night, trembling with a fury that had never once been aimed at her. She thought of Jude's cheek, resting against her knee, worship in a gesture most men would never have thought to offer. She thought of the dance by the firelight. 3 broken people, finding a rhythm, none of them had expected to find again. She found them both in the main room, sitting by the fire, quiet in the particular way of men who've survived something together and don't need words to say so. They looked up when she came to the doorway. Neither twin spoke. They simply watched her, waiting, the way they'd waited through every step of the last 2 weeks, never pushing, always ready. She crossed the room slowly, and something in the way she moved told them both, without a single word needing to pass between any of them, that whatever wall had stood between the 3 of them since that first night in Deadwood had finally come all the way down. What passed between them after that belonged to the firelight and the closed door, and to no one else. When morning came, the cabin held a different kind of quiet than it had the night before, the kind that settles over a house once every doubt has finally been laid to rest. Spring came to Wolftooth Peak the way it always does in high country, slow and grudging at first, and then, all at once, snowmelt roaring down the ravines and the first green pushing up through ground that had been frozen solid for what felt like a lifetime. The ledger in Cobb's confession had reached a federal judge back east by then, carried down the mountain, and onto the rail line by a rider Vance trusted with his life. And the response, when it finally came, arrived in the form of federal marshals and newspaper men, both descending on the territory in numbers nobody in Deadwood had ever seen before. The asylum ring came apart, the way rotten things do once the light finally hits them. Doctors who'd signed false commitment papers for 2 decades found themselves facing charges they'd never imagined answering for. Wealthy men back east who'd paid for the privilege of owning broken women discovered that money couldn't purchase silence once a federal judge held proof in his own hands. Elara Hayes, once inmate 447, was cleared of every charge that had ever been leveled against her. And the newspapers that had once run stories about dangerous escaped lunatics now ran stories about the woman who'd brought down an entire trafficking operation from a cabin at the top of a mountain, armed with nothing but a ledger, 2 mountain men, and a will that refused to break. The bounty money came with the spring thaw, too, along with seized assets from men who no longer had use for East Coast fortunes built on other people's suffering. It was more money than the cabin at Wolf Tooth Peak had ever seen, more than Vance and Jude had earned in a decade of trapping and hard labor combined. "What do we do with it?" Jude asked one evening, the 3 of them going over the numbers at the kitchen table. "Rebuilt now, sturdier than the one Thorne had shattered coming through the roof." "We build," Elara said, and there was no hesitation in it, like she'd been carrying the answer for weeks, waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. "There are women out there right now, in places like Blackwell, who don't have a mountain to run to, who don't have anyone willing to stand between them and the men who profit off calling them broken. You want to build a refuge," Vance said, understanding arriving in his voice before she'd finished explaining it. "I want to build a place where a woman who's been through what I've been through can learn to survive on her own terms. Shooting, tracking, defense. Everything I had to learn alone and afraid. Taught instead in a place that isn't afraid of what she is." Elara looked between the 2 men who'd once been strangers hiring a bride to end their solitude. "Now something else entirely, under your protection, if you'll have the work of it. I know it's not the quiet mountain life either of you signed up for." "We signed up for you," Jude said simply. "Everything after that's just details." They built through the summer, expanding the cabin into something bigger, a wing set apart for women who arrived the way Elara once had, frightened, wounded, certain the world had already decided what they were worth. Elara taught them different, the way she'd taught the twins, patient and exacting, refusing to let any of them believe they were less than capable simply because the world outside had told them so. By the time the first snow of the following winter dusted the peak, Wolf Tooth Peak had become known throughout the territory not as the home of 2 feared mountain men, but as a sanctuary, whispered about in careful, hopeful tones by women who needed somewhere safe to run. On a clear spring morning, a year after Elara Hayes first stepped off a stagecoach in Deadwood, clutching a false-bottom trunk, she stood on the porch of the cabin that had become her home, watching a new arrival make the long climb up the trail, escorted partway by Jude, who'd taken to meeting frightened women at the base of the mountain himself, understanding better than anyone what it meant to arrive somewhere broken and be met with patience instead of judgment. The wind caught the hem of her skirt, lifting it just enough to reveal the old scars along her leg, silver and pale in the morning light. She didn't reach down to smooth the fabric back into place the way she once would have. She let the wind do what it wanted, let the marks show plain in the sunlight, proof of everything she'd survived and everything she'd built since. Vance came up beside her, resting a hand at her waist, easy and certain, the gesture of a man who no longer had to wonder whether he had the right to touch her. "New arrival," he said, watching Jude's slow progress up the trail with the frightened woman beside him. "3rd one this month," Elara said, words spreading faster than I expected. Word spreads fast when it's good, Vance said. Faster than the bad kind ever did. She leaned into him. And when Jude reached the porch steps a while later, he settled on her other side, his hand finding her waist to match his brother's. And the three of them stood together, watching the new arrival take in the mountain that had once seemed to Alara like the last. Desperate refuge of a woman with nowhere else to go. It had become something greater than a refuge now. It had become a beginning, for her, and for every woman who climbed that trail after her. Proof that survival wasn't the end of a story, but the start of one, if a person was brave enough, and strong enough, and lucky enough to find the right people willing to stand beside her once the running finally stopped. She'd come as a desperate mail-order bride, answering an advertisement out of fear and calculation, looking only for a fortress to hide behind. She remained as something else entirely, not hidden, not broken, standing in plain daylight between the two men who'd taught her that being seen, fully and without flinching, wasn't a danger to survive. It was the whole point of surviving at all. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, long after the fire's gone out and the snow has melted off Wolf-Tooth Peak, it's this. Being seen is not the same thing as being safe, but it might be the closest thing to it that any of us ever get. Alara didn't answer that mail-order bride advertisement, looking for love. She answered it, looking for cover, for two strangers big enough and mean enough to stand between her and a world that had already decided what she was worth. That's not romantic. That's survival math, plain and simple. The kind of calculation people make when they've run out of softer options. And that's exactly why what happened next matters so much. Because somewhere between the ride up that mountain and the night, she finally pulled back her skirt and showed her scars without flinching. Alara stopped calculating and started hoping. That's the harder thing. Anybody can learn to survive. Survival is instinct. It's muscle memory. It's the thing your body does whether you tell it to or not. Hope is a choice. It's a door you open on purpose, knowing full well it might get slammed shut in your face. Alara had every reason to keep that door closed. Blackwell taught her that showing weakness got you hurt. But Vance and Jude didn't ask her to be strong. They asked her to be honest, and they met that honesty with something she hadn't been offered in years. Patience. That's the real lesson buried under all the gunfire and the flower dust and the mountain snow. The people worth keeping in your life aren't the ones who never see your scars. They're the ones who see them and stay anyway. Who don't flinch, who don't pity, who understand that a wound is just proof a person survived something that should have ended them. Vance and Jude didn't fall in love with a woman who had no past. They fell in love with a woman who'd fought like hell to have a future, and they respected that fight enough to fight alongside her instead of for her. And maybe that's the part that hits hardest for anyone watching who's ever felt like damaged goods. Like the thing that happened to you makes you less worthy of being chosen. This story says otherwise. It says your scars aren't the end of your value. Sometimes they're the whole reason somebody recognizes what you're made of. Alara didn't need saving. She needed people willing to stand next to her while she saved herself. And in the end, she did the same for every woman who came up that mountain after her. So if you take one thing away from Wolf-Tooth Peak, let it be this. Don't wait for someone who needs you to be perfect. Wait for someone who looks at every broken piece of you and says, just look, don't hold back. That's not weakness. That's the bravest kind of love there is. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me which chapter hit you hardest, and I'll see you in the next one. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. Any names, characters, events, locations, or situations portrayed in this narrative are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental.